France's new president came to power offering fresh ideas and a radically different outlook, encapsulated perhaps by his youth and lack of political baggage. Has Emmanuel Macron lived up to, so far, his promises? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Those who've known him for years, and don't forget he is now only just 40, say he was always different. An adult in short trousers, a born leader. So can Macron build France in his own image, make it a country to shape Europe of the 21st century, or has he already left voters feeling short-changed? He's been heralded as liberalism's new poster boy, defeating Marine Le Pen to stop a wave of populism rising in France and blocking the momentum of the right wing across Europe. Macron is seen as a centrist, bridging the gap between the left and the right. But does he have the formula for the way forward? Or has his centrism been a diversion?
Je continuerai à faire ce pourquoi vous m'avez élu. Rendre la France plus forte et plus juste.
Macron's meteoric rise lifted confidence in France and the European Union. It was a bridge between populism and technocracy. He was proclaimed by some as the saviour of the EU, putting a fresh face to old politics with his new party, En Marche.
Peu de gens imaginaient le voir fêter ses 40 ans à l'Élysée.
And while some of France's political elites have been accused of shady financial dealings, leaks about Macron revealed no big controversies in his party. Macron's book is entitled Revolution, but how much revolution can he really affect? A former banker, he became a millionaire after securing a multi-billion-dollar deal between Nestlé and Pfizer. No stranger to politics, he served as Minister of the Economy under his friend and former French President François Hollande. But does he have the interests of the many at heart? In cutting taxes for the rich, he's been accused of turning his back on the poor by calling Labour reform protesters slackers.
Monsieur Macron est le président des riches et il s'entoure de leurs commensaux. Il prépare une grande fête pour l'oligarchie et c'est le peuple qui va la payer.
He was criticised for failing to acknowledge France's colonial past at last year's G20 summit and said that Africa is being held back by what he called civilizational problems.
Quand des pays ont encore aujourd'hui 7 à 8 enfants par femme, vous pouvez décider d'y dépenser des milliards d'euros, vous ne stabiliserez rien. Donc, le plan de transformation, en quelque sorte, que nous devons conduire ensemble, en tenant compte des spécificités africaines, par et avec les chefs d'État africains.
A banker turned politician, Macron won votes with a fresh perspective and optimistic outlook. A centrist making radical public sector reforms. But is his political persona too contradictory? And is his promised revolution, as his party's title En Marche suggests, really going forward? And I'm pleased to say joining us today via Skype from Paris, we have the writer and historian Gavin Mortimer. At the round table, Diego Zuluaga, an economist at the Institute of Economic Affairs, who's also director of Epicenter, a collection of think tanks focusing on European policy. We have Carlson Anyangwe, an African politics analyst. We'll talk about France and the colonies with him, among other things. And Joseph Downing, a specialist in French politics at the London School of Economics. Thank you for coming in. Warm welcome to the roundtable. Gavin, let me come to you first, principally because you happen to be in Paris. Can you say that France has changed in the months since Emmanuel Macron became president?
There's no doubt about it. It was a feel-good factor returning to France. I noticed that just not only among my own friends and acquaintances, but in a French market, my local market, which is a good barometer, I think, of how the French are feeling And a survey last week asked the French people, are you optimistic for 2018? 59% said yes. Now, that's the highest it's been for many years.
You see, there is, as you describe it, perhaps a feel-good factor, but is there anything more concrete you could put your hands on, your finger on?
Yes, growth is predicted to grow this year by 1.7%. Unemployment is due to scheduled to drop to below 10%. That's still twice as much as the UK and Germany, but nonetheless, unemployment is slowly coming down. And of course, more than anything, I think, David, it's just the fact that what Macron has done on the international stage is hard to convey how poorly France was perceived abroad under François Hollande. And Macron, since he became president in May, he's met all the world leaders. He's in China at this moment and looking to do some trade deals with China. And there's a feeling that he's really reasserting France's authority and prestige on the international stage.
Okay, well, we're going to get on to China in just a moment. Interesting that it has been mentioned because he's just arrived. He's bringing his usual energy to a trip like that. He's coming to Britain in a couple of weeks' time or 10 days' time. But let me ask you, Joseph, only because you'll come from the London School of Economics, the growth that Gavin mentions there, is that because of Macron, or was it going to happen anyway?
Well, no, this is the really difficult thing to disentangle when you look at these kind of macro statistics. On a country like France, Macron's been in power since May. He has pushed through some quite substantive, quite far-reaching labour law reforms, but it's doubtful that any of the reforms have really contributed to this growth at this point, I would say. It's too early in his
So you think this
presidency
was going to happen anyway?
Quite probably,
and he's
yeah.
just sort of basically polished it and made it seem like it's him?
Yeah, in a sense, he's benefiting from the bounce that may not have been anything to do with him. But on saying that, it could also be that there is a renewed confidence in the economy under Macron. So in the run-up to the election, I mean, both Sarkozy and Hollande had such a dismal record in terms of getting anything right in domestic politics that I think investors and businesses were not so confident in France under those two presidents. And the spectre of the possibility of a runoff between Macron and Le Pen may have withheld a lot of business confidence in the run-up to the election, which is now people see a centrist in power who's pro, neoliberal reforms in the French labour market, who wants to tackle the unions. Maybe.
Well, I don't know whether he'll be able to. This is something I'd like to get
He's
into.
done quite well so far, surprisingly well so far. He's done the best of any president since the 90s, actually, with the unions.
Carlson, can I come to you in just a minute? I'm not sidelining you.
Yes.
We'll talk about economics in Africa, if I may, in just a minute. But I wanted to ask Diego this. I asked about concrete achievements. Can you put your finger on anything in particular, or perhaps something that hasn't happened that he would like to have happened?
I think the labour reform is about the only economic policy achievement that one can point to so far. I agree that the economic outcomes we're seeing, to the extent that they're good, in 1.7% by European standards isn't that good. The trend growth rate in Europe is 2% at the moment, so France is still lagging behind. It's an improvement, but even that is not Macron's responsibility or Macron's influence. I would agree with Gavin that it's a symbolic impact that he's had so far. He's clearly raised France's profile. He is much more reminiscent of the early presidents of the Fifth Republic, Charles de Gaulle, in that type of profile, much more imperial in his demeanor, and clearly has a European outlook. He probably has ambitions of a European office for himself, especially now that Angela Merkel seems to be on her way out. So I think symbolically it's been very important, bringing back some sort of ambition and
So when does reality hit home? Rather than just being the young, shining, ambitious youth, when does it suddenly become real that he's president of France and it's a tough job? When does it get hard?
I think it is becoming real slowly. It will very much come down to, once a German government has been formed, how he can effectively work to achieve the Europe-wide reforms in terms of a Eurozone treasury and greater Eurozone integration and so on, that he sought out and claimed would be his big achievement in terms of...
Okay, so perhaps he will try and align himself as the new, in quotes, leader of Europe. What about when it comes to Africa and France's colonial past? I mean, he went to Algeria.
Yes,
he didn't apologise for some of the actions during the civil war of the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
What is he saying?
I agree with my colleagues. This thing about the economic kind of upturn, sometimes these things actually are just fortuitous and circumstantial. We need to see how durable that is for Macron. for most of us, especially in Africa, we're much more interested in trying to see, is France, as represented by Macron right now, living up to the core values which France itself tries to project. And we all know France talks about égalité, it talks about fraternity. All these things. Is France living up to those values? When you look at it, from our perspective, France's performance in terms of race relations in France, in terms of discrimination, still leaves a lot to be desired. On the economic side, when Macron came to power, given his youthfulness, there was some hope, especially from the left.
But let me ask you this. One quote you gave to one of our producers beforehand who spoke to you said he displays more racism than his predecessors. Well, what do you mean by that?
What happens with Macron, he has, my friend describes an imperial outlook. And somebody says maybe he wants to mimic Napoleon Bonaparte. And he projects an image when somebody looks at him and the way he expresses himself and the way he talks, if you judge from when he came to Africa, it's still an imperialistic outlook. That of an old school headmaster who talks down on other heads of state, African head of state I'm talking about. And I don't think that has gone very well with the intellectuals in Africa.
You're talking about a pomposity, perhaps, an arrogance.
And this is one of the key hurdles that he has to overcome. It's a very fine balancing act.
Difference between confidence and overconfidence.
Exactly, and he's got an approval rating currently of 50%, which is very good, but it still means that 50% of people in France are not that impressed with him. And the critiques of Macron that I've heard so far, coming from France, and also I lived part of the time in Marseille from being in Marseille, is that they see him as pretentious, as thinking that he's the most intelligent person in the room, wherever he goes.
But equally, I've also heard that he makes people who he talks to feel like they're the only person that he's ever spoken to. Very special.
Exactly, but and it's weird because in France, they want this kind of style of leader. So both Hollande and Sarkozy, Hollande was too introverted, Sarkozy was extroverted but was seen as vulgar. And Macron now is again trying to recast himself in that mould of the old sort of homme politique of France, who is, you know, that head of state, the imperial almost kind of figure. Yes. And it's a very fine balancing act, one that he may get wrong. Because so far, it's not, we still don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. It could be his downfall.
Well, let's ask Gavin. I mean, what do you say the general impression of him as a person rather than a politician is?
As a person, people find it hard to warm to him. As a leader, they respect him and admire him. And Joseph's absolutely right, that France actually crave a strong leader, almost a regal figure. I mean, talking to a lot of my French friends and acquaintances, they regret that they chopped off the head of their king. There's a fascination in France, the British royal family. And so they very much want a strong leader. And I agree there's a fine line between arrogance and confidence. But Macron is an unashamed intellectual. And intellectualism is much more highly regarded in France than it is in much of elsewhere in particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, in Britain, for example. So at the moment, things are going well for him, and so the French are prepared to put up with his strange idiosyncrasies as long as he leads them forward on the international stage and domestically. And as we said, at the moment it's too early to say.
Who was? Let me throw this one to you, and then everybody else can kick in on it. Who was the last truly impressive French president in the eyes of the majority of the population to whom they would like to compare Macron? Gavin, you first.
Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle
That's a long time ago. Yes.
It is a long time ago, but he said France cannot be France without greatness. And Macron believes exactly that sentence.
Diego?
I would say Mitterrand as well. He was president in the 80s, had a lot of stature. He was a figure in the French resistance. I think we need to put this in the context of
I'd just like to finish this first.
Sure.
If we can.
Yeah, I would go Mitterrand.
Again, 30 plus years ago?
Yes. Yes, that's
I would say possibly Chirac. I would say possibly Chirac was the last great.
Okay, well, he was there. Okay, very interesting. But nobody of most recent times.
No.
Well, Chirac wasn't that long ago. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I wanted to put this in the context of France being a country which sees itself as in crisis since about the 1970s. You know, they talk about the 30 glorious years between the end of World War II and the 1970s, and then it's been not so glorious since. So this regal figure that's promising renewal, and basically without stating it in those terms, to make France great again, it is really what I think the French public were craving for quite a long time. So much of it is perception, and because France is still a very wealthy country, and it's not stagnating. It is growing slowly compared to its peers, but it's not stagnating. It's still innovative. It's still renewing itself. But there is a perception of ossification, of things staying the same, and there is certainly some sort of segmentation of minorities particularly, and the poor, not least to do with economic policy, which he is trying to address.
Let's get on to minorities, because it has proved to be a major thorn in the side of every French administration in recent times. Is he doing anything, in your opinion, to change?
My colleagues talk about France's glorious years and wealth. And the question, where does that wealth come from? I would suggest that wealth comes from Africa. And France without Africa, I don't know where that leaves France.
What about those people from former colonies, indeed other ethnic minorities who are in France and have long said that, you know, where we live in these banlieues is an appalling existence and are marginalised when it comes to employment, etc., etc. Is he doing anything to change their position?
Well, the shocking thing about the election campaign was the absolute absence of any of these questions.
That's right.
Now, part of the reason these questions were absent is because it is illegal for the French state to differentiate people by religion or ethnicity. So we have no statistics as to exactly how many Africans or Muslims there are in France. But, so that political culture means that you can't overtly address these questions. But also, these questions are so difficult to address.
But he could try and change the law, he could try and...
It would be suicide. Completely, it would be political suicide. To even talk about it would be political suicide. To try and change the law, I mean, we're talking about like a different dimension.
And yet every time people talk about France's problems, this is the one thing...
And unemployment may be 10% on a national level in France, but if you go to some of the suburbs of Marseille or Paris that you even see from the Eurostar as you come into Gare du Nord, unemployment for young people can be 60%. And these areas, I mean, with this kind of small growth and even with the labour market reforms in an attempt to create jobs, it's not going to help the fact that these people can't get jobs because they're black and Arab.
How can you possibly try and solve the problem if you can't say the problem exists because this person is black or is Arab and is being marginalised because of, etc., etc.?
And a great
it's impossible, isn't it?
There's a lot of vested interest as well in not raising it. I think if you have a protected labour market, there are some people who are being protected from competition. There are people who are being isolated and left out. But the people who are inside have no interest in the problem being raised because they are benefiting from the protections that these labour market regulations guarantee. We have to take this into account as well. So there might be interest in not changing the law.
And who are the interests?
That's very correct.
Well, I mean, it has to do with the trade unions.
Interest. That even if he tries to do that, they're going to go against him. And he knows this, he's aware of this.
And this is the interesting question about reform in France more generally, is if you look at the polls, everybody supports reform. But reform is a word that everyone can get behind, right? Until you begin to say, oh, we're going to reform your... No. I'm in the union. I don't want my pension reformed. Go after this.
But am I right in thinking that he has had some success with the unions because he's sort of... he's tried to divide and rule, if you like. He's taken on board the more moderate unions as his best friends and the more extreme ones.
Ignore the other ones.
And also he saved some of the toughest reforms for later on in his presidency. Reforms to unemployment benefits, reforms to the healthcare system, these kinds of things are going to come later. So what he's done so far is kind of dipping his toe a little bit into the pond of reform.
So, Gavin, do you think that this is the realpolitik that's going to come round to get him, or will be the making of him?
David, I just want to make a point there that you're quite right about the discrimination against ethnic minorities in France over the years. But also something else that desperately needs reforming is the education, because a lot of these young children are not getting a decent education, because in France, my daughter's in the French education system, has its strong points, its weak points, but what it doesn't do is it takes the cream, if you like, and it rises, the cream will rise to the top, and the children who struggle are cast aside. And Macron is aware of this, because root and branch reforms of education is one thing on his agenda. So I think that will make a big difference.
So the really hard things that are going to come up later in his presidency, let's go around the table. Gavin, first of all, just name one thing that's going to be really difficult.
I think immigration will be a difficult problem for him this year.
Diego?
The tax system, quite clearly.
In what way?
France has a tax system. First of all, it's overtaxing people, which has led a lot of talented people out of France. It spends too much money.
Some are coming back, am I right?
I suppose some are coming back, but still, you know, there's a lot to be done in terms of creating a tax system that is more fit for the 21st century, in terms of not discouraging people from working, not discouraging companies from being set up, not discouraging entrepreneurs from leaving the country. All of those things have been more successful elsewhere in Europe than in France. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that in classic sort of French policy fashion for the last few years, there's an attempt to shift some of the problems to the European level. So
I wanted to get onto Europe in just in just a moment. The biggest difficulty he's going to have, Joseph, what do you think next year?
Welfare reform.
Okay, and when it comes to
welfare reform, and I think he has to tackle the race issue. He cannot sweep it under the carpet. This is going to rebound.
Immigration from Gavin, race issue from you, welfare. So these are the things we should look out for.
Yes.
Now, does he see himself? You can come in again now. Does he see himself as the next quote in quotes leader of Europe?
I think so. I think he wants to be president of Europe, if there ever is going to be such an office. I think he would like to be the first one. And the timing couldn't be better for him, because you see a weakened German chancellor, you see sort of a rebirth of France, the other major countries have their own issues. Italy's still in the midst of economic reform, Spain has constitutional issues and political unity issues, Britain is leaving the EU, so that leaves France basically to take the baton. And Macron...
And also he's going to try and take some of the financial sector jobs from Britain to France, which will boost his image over there as well with employment and growth prospects.
And he's only 40 years old, so he still has 25 to go before he's Merkel's age or Jean-Claude Juncker's age. So, you know, or any, you know, the average age of the French president, which has been much older than, you know, your average political leader.
Quite patrician elderly men.
That's right.
Yeah. Gavin, I mean, what is his ambition for Europe?
I agree with what Diego says, but I would say that Macron has France's interests very much at heart. So he does want to relaunch Europe, but he wants Europe to dance to France's tune. It's all about making France great again. And as Diego said, he's in a very strong position at the moment because of the issues with Germany and Spain and the UK leaving. I think his biggest challenge will come from Eastern Europe. He's already had a run-in with the Polish Prime Minister about posted workers. And his vision of Europe is at odds with some of the countries in Eastern Europe.
What do you think?
I think if that is his ambition to become president of France...
President of Europe?
I'm sorry, Europe. There are two main things you have to address. The first one is the African baggage, this economic thing. I don't think many European countries are very comfortable with this colonial currency, which France is. The other thing which he would have to address, as far as Europe are concerned, this idea that French-speaking Africa is France's backyard and nobody else can come and poach in that area. And France
and other countries are coming now, aren't they? Countries, I mean, Turkey's looking at investments in...
Yeah, but countries that have tried to get out of that have eventually paid the price.
And China?
Yeah, China is very pragmatic. Sometimes China goes through France. Sometimes China gets a contract, or French company get a contract and subcontract to France, to China.
That's not stereotype, but inscrutable is the word that comes to mind with that one. Let's talk about his trip to China at the moment, because this is pivotal. What is he actually looking for out of the relationship with the country that once looked, let's say, to the UK as its eyes and ears in Europe, not necessarily economically, but as its eyes and ears in Europe, and is now looking to France for this particular role?
And it's very interesting because, I mean, traditionally a lot of the top politicians in France have had almost a kind of China obsession in a kind of orientalist sense, right? They're very intrigued by China. It's not a place that they had strong colonial links with. It's still a place of mystery, right? So to the French, to go to China and for him to be seen as, you know, someone important on the world stage, to be received by China in that regard, will do wonders to bolster, I think, his prestige. But then whether or not he will be able to get the real kind of economic and political connections that he wants from China will be another.
Is he driven perhaps by his wife, so much older than him, but who's now being pilloried in the press for perhaps being a little bit grandiose? Is he driven by her, or is he a driven man on his own?
I think he's driven by himself entirely. I think if you look at, at the biographical details we've got of him, he's always seen himself as special and sort of, and he has been to an extent, exceptional in many ways. So I don't think he has any outside influences. It's clearly his own vision of himself. He's inspired by the French past and French history, I think, to a great extent. In terms of China, you see a lot of protectionism on him. He's distrustful of it. He doesn't want Chinese companies to buy up French companies. He's currently engaged in privatizing a range of companies, and they've explicitly said they don't want Chinese investors to take majority stakes. And he wants to make it the European position. So it's not, it's a carrot and stick approach, really.
But it's fascinating, isn't it? And but we're coming to the end of the program. It's fascinating, isn't it, that perhaps some of the attraction is that everything we're seeing from him is pretty new because he is pretty new. And in a year or so, once we've got used to the way that he works and the way he deals with other countries, then perhaps we'll have a better idea of where we can place him in history. But a fascinating, I'm sorry, Gavin, I'd love to carry on the conversation. We'll have to do so privately over a cafe. Thank you for coming on the programme, and thank you too, very much indeed. As I say, we'll have to wait and see a little bit, but do you remember that old French expression? I'm not going to try it because I've got a cold and it'll sound terrible and I'll probably get it wrong, but translated to English, it basically means the more things change, the more things stay the same.
And that's what's happening in Africa. Nothing has changed. It's the same difference for all the presidents. Macron the same.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, they're still talking over there, and all of the team. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.